Welcome to the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance. Today we have with us a group of very eminent researchers who've been working on this research project for almost a decade. We're going to start with Tim Kelsall, who's the co-director of the research project, Effective States and Inclusive Development. Over to you, Tim.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. It's really lovely to be here at the Mandela School. The title of our presentation today is Rethinking the Politics of Development. It's built on work that has been done at ESID, the Effective States and Inclusive Development Research Centre, which is what's called a research programme consortium based in the University of Manchester, but with partner organisations in Africa and Asia, and with funding from the UK's Department for International Development. This topic of rethinking the politics of development is also the subtitle of ESID's flagship conference, which will be held in Manchester this September, and I would encourage as many of you as possible to try and come to that. We'd love to see you there. I think I should probably also say that ESID's approach to the politics of development is part of a broader field of academics and practitioners who have increasingly come to see politics as being, the key to development. So I think we went through a period of 20 or 30 years when it was thought that maybe institutions were the key to development. But more recently that has been superseded by this idea that underneath institutions there are politics and power relations, and we really need to understand those if we want to know how institutions function in different contexts. So the book covers I've got here, there's, I'm sure some of you will know, are Violence and Social Orders by Douglas North, Wallace and Weingast. I mean, North, of course, was one of the original proponents of the idea that it's institutions that matter, but even he has shifted towards a more sort of political understanding of development. Why Nations Fail by Acemoglu and Robinson. And I think it's James Robinson who made this quote that it's the politics, stupid, that explains development. And then some of these themes, which are quite similar to the way ESID has been thinking, are also picked up in the World Bank's 2017 World Development Report, Governance and the Law, which despite its title is actually much more about politics than it is about the law. Now, the kind of political framing that ESID has used in its research is called political settlements analysis. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Political settlements analysis is one of a broad school of approaches, as I mentioned. It goes beyond institutions to analyse the power relations with which institutions are entwined. And practically, I think it provides an alternative to the good governance agenda, in the sense that it doesn't seek to impose a set of ideal institutions, most of which have been drawn from sort of Anglo-American history, onto an unsupportive foundation of power. Instead, it looks for realistic ways of improving development outcomes given the existing configuration of institutions and power. And this approach, political settlements analysis, has become increasingly influential in donor circles. So DFID in particular, but also the World Bank, the European Union, the OECD, USAID a little bit, a variety of development partners have begun basing their programming around political settlements analysis. So what is a political settlement? Well, ESID's done quite a bit of conceptual work around this. There are some rival definitions of what a political settlement is out there. There's also quite a bit of confusion on this topic, but the way we're going to define it today is that it's an ongoing conflict-ending agreement among powerful groups over a set of political and economic institutions that yields a distribution of benefits that's acceptable not necessarily to everyone, but to those powerful groups. The idea being that institutions, political and economic institutions, will be supportive be supported and therefore sustainable as long as they're delivering these benefits to powerful groups. If they stop delivering benefits to powerful groups, then there will be a process of political contestation, and we would expect to see these political and economic institutions change. Or if someone's attempted to introduce new economic institutions which go against the interests of these powerful groups, we would expect these new institutions to be resisted. Not necessarily always successfully, but we would definitely expect to see some political struggle there. Now, in ESID's work, what we've tended to do is to home in on this dimension of the concept, the powerful groups. And what we've argued is that this notion of powerful groups can be split into two dimensions, which give us a lot of leverage over how the politics of development happens. So first of all, the size and social identity of these political groups, what we call their social foundation, or to be more precise, it's those groups that get co-opted by the settlement that make up the social foundation of the settlement. And then secondly, their political cohesion, the kind of degree of unity among these political groups. And we call this the power configuration of the settlement. So I can illustrate this now with a couple of diagrams. On the left, I'm going to show you a political settlement with what we call a narrow social foundation. I should probably cycle back a bit and say, what do we mean by a powerful group? A powerful group is a group which we say has the potential, either acting alone or in concert with others, to actually disrupt or overturn the settlement itself. Okay? So it has the potential to overthrow these political and economic institutions. That's what constitutes a powerful group, and for a political settlement to be sustainable, it's these groups with these potential that the governing coalition needs to get on side. Okay? Are you following me so far? Okay. Okay, so this is a political settlement with what we call a narrow social foundation. So we have an inner circle and an outer circle of power, and we have a number of powerful groups here who are co-opted by the governing coalition. They make up the social foundation of the settlement. But outside of here, can you see this? Yeah? Outside of here, we have an even sort of larger collection of groups that are marginal to the settlement. And they're marginal because they can't muster the organisational capacity to really challenge these political and economic institutions. So if the powerful groups might be made up of, depending on the society we're talking about, it might be political parties, it might be the military, it might be militia groups, it might be mafias, it might be peasants. It all depends on their degree of organisational capability. It might be voters if you have a genuine democratic system, because voters can actually vote to change political and economic institutions, right? It will differ society by society. But in these societies which have a narrow political settlement, the marginal groups will be larger than the groups that have this disruptive potential. So you might have a society in which, for instance, the disruptive potential is held by maybe landowners, maybe trade unions, maybe a few politicians, but you have the sort of mass of peasants and workers who aren't actually sort of politically empowered to really challenge the terms of the settlement. Therefore, they're marginal to it. Therefore, the governing coalition doesn't really have to think about distributing benefits to them in order to reproduce the settlement. Okay, we can contrast this with a broad social foundation where the co-opted groups, those groups with disruptive potential, are now much larger. And the groups that are marginal, or the groups that maybe have some disruptive potential but aren't co-opted, instead they're repressed. They are repressed. Those groups are much smaller. So that's the difference between a narrow and a broad social foundation. Moving on to the configuration of power, we can have contexts which we describe as having a unipolar or concentrated configuration of power. And in these contexts, the top leadership is unified and it's able to dictate terms to other groups in society. It's more powerful than other groups in society. It can easily get them to do its bidding. So it makes a policy decision, and typically it can implement that policy decision effectively. By contrasting what we call a multipolar or dispersed power configuration, the top leadership is not unified, it isn't more powerful than other powerful groups in society. If it wants to get things done, it has to engage in a process of negotiation and bargaining. And sometimes even after this process of negotiation and bargaining, it finds that its policy objectives get diluted or get resisted or get undermined. So putting these together, ESID has come up with a typology and a set of theoretical propositions that are derived from that typology. So we have these two axes, the social foundation, it can be broad or it can be narrow. And we have power concentration or the power configuration, it can be concentrated or it can be dispersed. Now where we have a broad dispersed political settlement, what we're likely to see is a lot of demand from potentially politically disruptive groups for benefits. So the governing coalition, the political leadership, are going to feel under pressure to deliver benefits to broad swathes of the population. However, because power is dispersed, it's difficult for the governing coalition to build an effective machinery to actually deliver those benefits. Because every time it tries to agree on a policy and implement that policy, it has other centres of power pulling it in different directions. Often we find that these broad dispersed power configurations are characterised by populist policies and by patron-client forms of service delivery or policy delivery. Now, moving down in a narrow dispersed settlement, we have the same problems when it comes to building an effective delivery machinery, but if also you don't even have a strong demand for a broad distribution of benefits, because the groups that can actually disrupt the settlement are narrowly distributed. So what you tend to get in this situation is a very sort of elitist and ineffective form of policy making and implementation. Moving along to a narrow and concentrated type, we'll find here that the constituency with disruptive potential is narrow, therefore there won't be a strong demand, there won't be strong pressures on the leadership to distribute benefits broadly, but the elite will be quite concentrated and unified. So if it actually puts its mind to delivering a particular programme, it could be economic development, or it could be an elite-based form of social development, it can generally do that quite effectively. It doesn't get pulled in different directions by competing interest groups or disruptive social constituencies. And then finally in the top right, we have a broad concentrated settlement. So here the demand for inclusive policies is high, but also because the elite is unified, it's able to build the machinery to deliver these benefits effectively. However, there's a caveat or a proviso to this, which is that a society's institutional inheritance matters. So for instance, if for one reason or another a political settlement has inherited strong institutions, for instance a strong state machinery, then even though you have a broad and dispersed power situation, you may still be able to deliver benefits fairly effectively through this strong state machinery, because the chances are, well, you have a better chance of being able to insulate that machinery from from this kind of push and pull of different political forces, because you have a kind of historical inheritance there. Now, if we look at trying to apply this typology to the South African case, and Brian will talk about this in much more detail, but just to give you a taster, our hunch is that apartheid-era South Africa would be an example of a narrow and concentrated political settlement in which the disruptive potential of society was fairly narrow, at least during certain periods of apartheid. And therefore the elite didn't feel under pressure to distribute benefits widely, but nevertheless the governing elite was relatively unified, and therefore it was able to oversee the building of a fairly effective state machinery. Post-apartheid, the settlement has broadened in the sense that a much broader range of social groups has been empowered or has acquired that disruptive potential. But also, I think because the ANC is a fairly broad church, there are different factions underneath it, and also because there are different groups outside the ANC, the unity of the elite has become weakened. So we've moved to a rather more dispersed power concentration. And this has certain implications for what it's possible to achieve in South Africa currently, and what might be the best way of achieving the things that you do want to achieve. Okay, so now I'm going to hand over to Sam, who's going to tell you a little bit more about the ESID research.
Okay, so before Brian comes in and applies the concept to South Africa, we're going to have a sort of whistle-stop tour through some of the work that ESID has done in other contexts around a range of some of our policy domains. So what we wanted to do is to see if the framework that Tim has set out could give us more traction and better answers to some puzzles that have either been well wrestled with, such as how do countries grow, how do they avoid collapse, can they move towards structural transformation, how do countries avoid the natural resource curse, but maybe haven't been dealt with very satisfactorily in our view at least. Alongside another couple of puzzles which I don't think we've had enough research on, such as when governments decide to protect and promote the rights of vulnerable groups, and how governments are able to increase the quality, if not just the quantity, of social service delivery. So we wanted to look across a range of puzzles to make sure we could claim to be living up to the title of looking at inclusive development. And what we did was choose a set of cases that reflected the settlement types Tim's referred to, particularly around the concentration of power. So we worked in particularly dispersed contexts such as Ghana and Bangladesh, and concentrated contexts such as Rwanda and Uganda. And this is where we did the majority of our work around a range of these different policy domains around growth, natural resource governance, social provisioning, gender equity, some work on domestic violence legislation, and work on public sector reform. These are the four main countries. We worked in over 16 countries altogether. And we've got something like 70 plus observation points. And what I mean is, well, an observation point for us is an in-depth qualitative case study of how a country, say Uganda, governed its oil. So we have a set of outcomes around oil governance in Ghana and Uganda, and we trace them all the way back through key informant interviewing, triangulating with documentary evidence to work out how did the country get to that particular point. So that was our process tracing method, and we did that across all of the range. So we've got quite a number of observation points to draw on. And our work is very accessible. We're really pleased. Hopefully you'll be pleased too that we've been using British taxpayers' money to make sure this knowledge is democratised and fully available. So here are some of the books that have been published, all open access. If you get onto our website, you can access all of these books on deals and developments around growth, governing extractive industries, negotiating gender equity in the global south, and I'll come on to the education work in a bit. So all this work's there. There's more to come as well. So I'm going to go through three of these domains, starting with natural resource governance, to give you a flavour of what we found. So within the work on natural resource governance, which relates to a couple of the SDGs you see there, we took just 2 countries. We've moved on to look at 5 altogether in this phase, but I'll stick with the ones that we've completed the research on. Ghana and Uganda, which both found oil around the same time in roughly the same quantities in the mid-2000s. These are not huge oil producers, they're not Nigerias or Angolas, but oil finds of a level at which make a significant difference to their political economies, roughly 5 to 6% of GDP, for example. So it changed the nature of the game in these countries. And the reason we wanted to compare them is because they're roughly comparable in terms of the timing and the size of the source, but very different in terms of the indicators that you would normally use to predict which country would escape the resource curse. So the predominant literature here, as many of you will know, is a neo-institutionalist approach to understanding that if countries have got certain sets of institutions in place at the time of major natural resource discoveries, they stand a better or worse chance of governing that oil in a way that provides dividends for the national interest as against elements of the resource curse, whether political, economic, environmental dimensions of that. Now you'd expect on paper for Ghana to be doing a lot better on every indicator of economic development, democracy and governance beyond maybe growth levels over a certain period. It outstrips Uganda in terms of governance effectiveness and accountability in particular, and a much higher score on democracy compared to Uganda. This is using Policy 4 data on the democracy side. So we expected from a new institutional good governance reading to find that Ghana would be doing better than Uganda. And at that time, the point of comparison was how well was each country doing with driving deal making with international oil companies? Were they getting deals that looked like they were favourable in the national interest? Ghana's moved much further into production than Uganda, so we stuck with what was comparable in this case. And so we compared them as examples of good governance indicators and as examples of different types of political settlement, with Ghana being much more having dispersed forms of power and Uganda being much more concentrated. And we found quite quickly that Ghana wasn't as performing as you would have expected in terms of a good governance reading. When we looked at how it went about the deal-making process, it was rushing into making deals with fairly short-term horizons, as would have been predicted by the high degree of political competition and the pressure that places on political parties in power to move towards generating rents quickly. So Ghana actually breaks records between 2007 to 10 to make sure it signs its first oil contracts in advance of the 2012 elections, in the midst of a bit of an oncoming macroeconomic crisis as well. And it's interesting, it does this before it puts in place legislative arrangements to govern those deal-making processes. So the legislation comes after most of the main deals are made around the biggest field at that time, the Jubilee field. Even when Ghana then does move a couple of years later to put in place regulatory institutions to offset Dutch disease effects, such as rules against borrowing against future debt, going into debt against future oil earnings, these then get overturned within parliaments in line with what the ruling party wanted to do to generate matching fundings to go with so they could accept major infrastructure loans, in this case a major $3 billion infrastructure loan from China for the Western Province, which is where the offshore oil lies off. So we had institutions overturned. And when we looked at the actual deals that were made, and it's interesting that Ghana and Uganda both dealt with at least one oil company, the same oil company in both places, that Ghana was getting worse deals than Uganda in terms of the government take price per barrel than Uganda was getting. This wasn't just our research, it was we found out from insider consultancy reports and other fiscal regime comparisons that Ghana wasn't doing badly in terms of the overall average in sub-Saharan Africa, but Uganda was doing above average in comparison. And we started tracing this to various features. And the features we identified were really related to political settlement factors and how they shape bureaucratic functioning. So what we found in Uganda was that a president who'd been in power for an awfully long time, Yoweri Museveni, since 1986, when he came into power, Shell and other oil companies came to him and said, look, we know you've got decent reserves, hand over production rights to us, we can develop these. He asked how many geologists do we have in the country? One of the wrong type, not the soft rock type. So he said, no, we're not shaking hands with anybody until we train up our people. He sent lots of people out for training, India, Brazil, Scotland and so on, Norway for training, and built up a small pocket of what became a pocket of effectiveness within the Ministry of Energy. Highly trained bureaucrats who he allowed to function and do their work, and they only had one principle to refer to throughout this whole period. And they were able to make good deals, and we've got good quotes from the international organisations, Norway, the oil companies that dealt with them, of the capacity of the technocrats and how much space they had to operate here. So they drove good deals with strong presidential commitment. Over here, when the change of political power came in 2006, what happened with the new governments in power was a decimation of the capacity that was built up in this sector, because the oil company was seen as being the creature of the ruling party that was just leaving power. 90% of staff get kicked out, and the president starts making deals with advisors who are not well schooled in the oil technocracy. Correspondingly worse deals. So we found that this was interesting. We didn't know what we were going to find when we started digging in. We found that our framework gave us more traction than a good governance framework would have given us. And the issues, most of the international discussion around oil governance is focused on accountability, and we were finding that state capacity was really important at certain areas, and the pockets of effectiveness played a significant role in this. So that gave us a bit of confidence that the framework was telling us something, at least at this level of natural resource governance. We wanted to move much beyond what can happen in closed rooms between oil companies and government technocrats, and to look at other aspects of development. And to address issues of redistribution, we looked at the remarkable spread of social assistance in sub-Saharan Africa. The extent to which now, I think between 2010 and 2016, the number of sub-Saharan African countries with at least one non-contributory social assistance scheme doubled. So we now have over 40 countries with a social assistance transfer scheme. And we were interested to see if we could explain the political drivers of this. We don't have a book on this yet, but I'm very pleased to say that Jeremy has joined forces with us, and we have a book coming out later this year, we hope, I think, with OUP, which brings the Cape Town group together with our group into a book on this. But I'll just talk about our cases for now. So we wanted to explain what the key drivers were. And we were dissatisfied with some of the number crunching that had been done to explain this. Was it just a case of GDP? If countries grew, they would start to spend more automatically. Not a great fit emerges when you try and plot the two against each other, social protection expenditure against GDP growth. Doesn't get a lot better when you plot it against democracy using Policy 4 data. There's a lot on your left there as you're looking at it of countries that score below zero on the policy score. They've got minus scores that are spending similar levels as countries across this side. So we weren't very satisfied that we could get to this through large-scale explanations around growth or democracy. So we went into process tracing mode again to look at this, and we wanted to look to work out, there's pretty poor data on the spread of social assistance in sub-Saharan Africa, so we created our own index for not just when countries adopted these schemes, which could be obviously a very donor-driven artifact, given the role of the World Bank and others in promoting this. We wanted to know at what stage government started to institutionalise social assistance. And I won't go into great detail about how we've done this. This is work that Tom Lavers has been leading on at Manchester. But we had 5 indicators of institutionalisation in terms of the statutory status of this. Does it go beyond a pilot programme through a full programme up to having a legal basis and constitutional basis potentially? The reach as a proportion of the poorest. How much government financing went in to get away from the donor-driven issue, whether government structures were used rather than sort of parallel project structures used to implement, and the scope, whether it's national in scope. And we scored all of these to give us we averaged them out with extra weights to reach to make sure these were poverty-focused programmes, and came up with a sort of ranking. So we looked at 8 countries. So the 4 that I mentioned, plus another few. We also had Ethiopia, Mozambique, Tanzania and Zambia in this sample as well, another range of concentrated dispersed type countries. You can't probably see which countries here, but I'll go on to explain what we found in terms of trajectories. The 2 or 3 key things to note are that most of the adoption happens around a key period in the mid-2000s, so you do definitely have a transnational effect here where this becomes a big agenda for international organisations promoting this. But then adoption is never the last thing. So adoption, apart from Ethiopia, which goes from adoption to institutionalisation very rapidly and then sort of evens out. In every other case, you have other breaks where adoption happens, then you have nothing happening for a while, and then a jump, and then nothing, and then a jump. And our process tracing proved that you can't explain that just through donor issues. These are when they become government-owned programmes increasingly. So we wanted to explain that issue. And what we found is 2 or 3 different pathways that complicates the dominance versus competitive a little bit. So on a competitive pathway, which countries such as Ghana, Kenya, Zambia, to some extent Tanzania, because of electoral pressures in the last decade. So we start with a donor-driven agenda, resisted by elites. Often discourses of deservingness and dependency play strongly here, and there's no immediate move to take them up. But over time, the electoral benefits, the potential for social assistance to become part of rent distribution strategies becomes apparent, and elites start buying into this. So in Ghana, 2007-8, not a huge pressure from elections, but growingly in 2012 and 16. Kenya, 2002, 7 and 12, these are where you see the spikes and the recent commitment after the previous election to universalising the pension. Zambia, 2010, competitive pressures within CCM start to boost support for the TASAF programme, and then partisan positioning of that around the 2015 elections. So we found quite a lot of push from elections really mattering in when the institutionalisation process starts. Not so much Zambia, where we find it's more a crisis of how rents get distributed to rural areas. Food subsidies had gone into collapse, and social assistance grants came in as a replacement in that particular case. So elections really mattering here. And that's a very different set of sequencing to what happens in where power was concentrated in Ethiopia and Rwanda, where you find a perception amongst elites who are not really threatened by elections at all, but were threatened by what they perceive to be distributional crises. So in Ethiopia, you have another food security crisis in the late 90s and early 2000s, 2001 in particular, which comes at the same time as a split within the EPRDF, which enables it to become more cohesive around a different ideological agenda. And Malaise refers to food security as a crisis of security for the whole country, and they seek a policy response to that and work with donors to put the PSNP, Productive Safety Net Programme, in place. In Rwanda, what you find in 2006-7 is that the rate of poverty reduction suddenly drops off. And this causes panic at a leadership retreat amongst the RPF, the ruling party in Rwanda. The social foundations of power are very uneven numerically between the ruling minority Tutsi group and the Hutu majority. And the legitimacy of the RPF rests heavily on being able to be seen to distribute resources evenly. And if you have a crisis in poverty reduction, this is potentially leads into the types of crisis that we saw before, at least in the mindset of the Rwandan elite. So then they start looking for a means to respond to this. They look to Ethiopia and donors and bring them in to support. It wasn't donors pushing it in the case of Rwanda, it was the other way around. And you see social protection being brought within the overall developmental strategy of these regimes. Very different to what we see in places where power is concentrated, but we don't have an ideological project. So countries like Mozambique and Uganda, not much chance of power changing hands, but not much of a developmental ideology in place either. What drives things in Mozambique is a major spike. We have a doubling of social protection around 2008 and again 2010. Donor pressures, but also the urban riots that take place around those times, and a crisis in living standards. The government sits on the new findings of living standards because they drop so badly that they don't allow the data to be released because of fear of public unrest. And so at that stage they launch the policies, doubling 2 big programs in particular. Uganda's our negative case. If you go back to the institutionalisation, this is Uganda down here. It's the worst performer. And this because it really doesn't have any of the main features I've identified. It's the power is concentrated, but the president is increasingly vulnerable to competitive pressures. There's no strong ideological project, and there's no sense of systemic vulnerability. There was no crisis that Museveni felt the need to respond to. He had a very low-level response. He only goes for this when a small group come to his residence at the weekend in Western Uganda and say, "How come these guys next door have got the social pension? We want that here." And he goes, "Okay," and he writes a letter to the Minister of Gender and said, "That's the next district. It's in the north. He wants some votes there. Not his fate, not the strongest area for him. And please prepare for the national rollout." But it's a fairly pathetic level of commitment when you look at what it's being committed. So we get quite a lot from here in terms of the social foundations and the level of threat perception in relation to social groups. When we get to implementation, the political configuration comes through strongly in terms of how capable countries like Ethiopia and Rwanda have been at pushing this out in a fairly impartial way. I'll come on to implications later if we have time for donors. And the last one I'll talk about is a really tough challenge for developing countries, which is how to make sure that kids don't just have places in school, but they're actually learning while they're there. So Lamp Pritchett's work on the learning crisis was quite inspirational for us here. This touches on a new book that's come out with 6 country case studies, including South Africa, and Brian's book with colleagues goes into much greater depth into the comparative work on Western and Eastern Cape within South Africa. So I'll be quite brief here. What we found here is that all of our cases are done brilliantly in terms of access, real success story in terms of making sure kids had a place in school. You find really high levels of improvement there. Much less progress in terms of learning outcomes. The data's horrible on learning outcomes. There is no good internationally comparable data for this, but this is one of the best we could find, and it fits with our process tracing. The country that's flatlining here is Rwanda, whereas the others are making some progress in terms of learning outcomes, but nowhere near at the same level as access. What we found when we started digging into this a bit more deeply is that the social foundations of settlements are really important here. That the powerful groups and the coalitions they form in relation to the governing coalition were heavily aligned around the access agenda. You have often populist presidents reliant on large rural constituencies backed by donor finance and unions who benefit from more employment. So it's a no-brainer to increase access. No one opposed it. Girls' education as well was nowhere opposed in this. It was fully supported. When you get to driving up learning outcomes, which involves more highly trained teachers, making sure teachers turn up, stay on task, don't take other jobs and so on, this is much tougher to actually do. You may not get, you're unlikely to get the support of unions in this. You don't have, in our countries, beyond the Cambodia case that we include in our book, you don't have businesses that are working in globally competitive areas that require upgrading of human capital to be competitive at a global level, so you don't have the push from business. And middle-class parents who typically make sure schools operate, function well at the local level, have already left. They've exited to private education. We were looking at public education. So none of the powerful coalitions that can push for quality education were in a powerful position in any of the countries we looked for. And so it's difficult to overcome this problem. But we also found that concentration of power, unipolar settlements, may be struggling a bit more so than multipolar settlements. We did find really interesting localised differences in performances with some high-performing districts in Ghana and low-performing, likewise in Uganda. And we found that where they were high-performing, it was because of the space that democratic decentralisation had given to multi-stakeholder coalitions to come together and put in place institutional fixes to these collective action problems at a local level. Where you had more top-down hierarchical approaches, the Rwanda mode of governance, they found it really difficult to deal with a tricky problem like educational quality, which requires lots of information flows, multiple transactions, day in, day out, and don't really fit with the more top-down approach. So our basic point is that we need to understand how the configuration of power and social foundations, what configuration that is, how it interacts with specific policy domains. Oil is not the same as education, and this is what shapes the commitments and capacity to deliver. So that's our sort of framework for this. But Brian's going to see how it applies to South Africa.
Okay, so I'm going to pick up again, going to sort of traverse that sweep, but traverse it in the specific South African context. And I'm going to begin by going back to Tim's last slide, where he located the South Africa case in the space of a broad social foundation with a multipolar or dispersed power configuration. And the question is, what does that imply for ways forward? Just to put a bit more detail into that. So the South African political settlement of the 1990s using this frame. First key point, I think, that distinguishes middle-income South Africa from the lower-income countries that Sam was talking about was the nature of the inherited institutions. Strong platform of impersonal institutions are part of the legacy, but oriented towards the white minority. And then elaborating on Tim's earlier comment, the power configuration, an elite bargain, which we would describe as dispersed. It's a painstakingly negotiated constitutional order using those impersonal institutions with strong checks and balances, which are navigating tensions between economic and political elites, multiple political parties, and the ANC, which is an alliance but is essentially an umbrella for itself, a rather dispersed set of elites. Social foundation, broad rather than narrow, as Tim said, incorporation of non-elites, formally through electoral contestation, but de facto under the umbrella of the ANC and its commitment to a better life for all. But when we think about the South Africa Social Foundation, we need to keep in mind that its inequality after taxes and transfers is amongst the most extreme in the world. So that's it's brief elaboration of Tim's framing. So where does it take us? And we had a very interesting exchange, Tim and I, around this as we were preparing this. And one might frame that exchange as, on the one hand, you have hope and rules. On the other hand, maybe you have the kinds of realities that the ESID framework teases out. So what's the hope? The hope of this framework was that a combination of a carefully crafted agreement underpinned by strong checks and balances and a capable bureaucracy would provide a platform for reality. What's another story? And in a sense, this is the story that Tim's frame offers. And so I actually quote from an email Tim sent me at 3 a.m. this morning, was it, Tim?
It was a bit later than that.
4:30 a.m. So what he said was, South Africa's political settlement at a general level is quite broad and rather dispersed. We would expect to see more of an emphasis on social provisioning than on growth, with some prospects for social provisioning success given bureaucratic capabilities, and with growth playing second fiddle to social policy and redistribution. So that's Tim coming in offering the 20,000 feet view, which was really quite salutary as one went through this. Now, in fact, we've been working with this framework, with the ESID group, for the last 7 or 8 years, and in applying the typology, I'm going to draw on 2 of the ESID research projects that we've done here. The one, it's a piece that I wrote with Alan Hirsch on business-state relations. You'll see why we called it elaborate scaffolding and weak foundations in a moment. It's part of a broader comparative look at business-state relations in middle-income countries. Turkey, Egypt, India, some Mexico, some Brazil. And then the other one, building on the social provisioning, just going to say a little bit about the education work that we launched back last November. So let me begin with the one with Alan on the business-state relations. We all know that South Africa has been stuck in a slow growth trap for when you actually look at it post-1990 relative to most middle-income countries. But what is really startling is when you look at what's happened to South Africa's manufacturing share of GDP over the last, I think this is a quarter century or so. Beginning of this period, 1990, of these, it's the middle-income countries I mentioned, South Africa's manufacturing share of GDP is the highest of the group. By the end of the period, and this continues to decline, I believe, South Africa's manufacturing share of GDP has gone from 24% down to about 13%. So there's been massive deindustrialization in South Africa, much larger in scale than many of the other countries. Sort of score 1 for Tim. The question is why? Alan and I drilled down into this, and this was the hypothesis that we actually, which we came to sort of along the way of the research. And that was this, and it's a little counterintuitive when we think about how these discourses play out in the South African context. Our hypothesis was that relative to the comparator countries, we've been doing this work, middle-income countries, South Africa's economic reforms were disproportionately based on impersonal rules, rather than cohesive shared commitments to a vision and a strategy for development. It was actually the preoccupation with impersonality at the expense of the cohesion that we think undercut this. Further, we found, and I'll run through this in a moment, we found that in fact that these reforms were not underpinned by interests who were both core to the political settlement in terms of their power and actually had a genuine compelling commitment to competitive markets anchored in impersonal rules. And the result, we argued, was a reform package that lacked adaptive capability, being so strongly tied to formalistic structures, and was politically vulnerable to erosion over time. Briefly, the paper drills down in some depth into 2 aspects of this. It looks at the evolution of BEE, and it looks at the NEDLAC, the Business, Government, Labour, Social Forum, and how these played out over time. And just the paradoxical headline, all I'll note for now on NEDLAC, is that rather seemingly perverse feature that disciplining reforms were supported through the NEDLAC, but actually proactive efforts to build capability rather quickly withered. And the question we puzzled on is, what's going on. And again, just to underscore the general point, this is a quote from the South African presidency in 2003. Alan, were you in the presidency in 2003?
You can attribute that to Joel Nxele.
Okay, so this is Joel Nxele who actually says this. It's this theme one of the characteristics is that political leadership in government is quite distinct from economic leadership. This has benefits because you don't get trapped in an old boys club, but the disadvantage is that the kind of trust needed between economic and political elites for high levels of investment was missing in the post-1994 South African case. That's from Joel Nxele 2003. So when we, in this paper that we have, and it's available both on the Mandela School website and on the ESID website, when we try to reinterpret the reversals in this industrial policy and growth more broadly, we sort of come up with, we think some parts of it we just underscore. I'll say more about some of them later. Yes to the narrative of the rise of patronage and state capture as a proximate explanation. Yes to inequality as an underlying structural driver. Yes to the effect of the global financial crisis. Yes to unanticipated structural constraints, notably rise of China and unexpected deep-seated weaknesses in the human resource base. But we add to that in our explanation that the champions of economic reform were actually weaker than was anticipated in the 1990s, and the consequences of this disproportionately rule-bound feature of the South African system. So just to underscore those two. First, why do we argue that the champions were disproportionately weak? Well, if we look at who were the two core champions of the economic reform package of the 1990s. I dare say we could call this package GEAR as a shorthand for it, Alan. The two champions were organized large-scale business. How committed was organized large-scale business to a developmental agenda in the South African context? I think when one reflects on it, it's also including with hindsight, what were the core interests of large-scale business? One was an interest in free capital flows. A second was an eagerness to globalize. If you actually look and we walk through it in the paper, the post-94 experiences of the large-scale business establishments, they globalize, and strikingly little interest on the part of those established large-scale actors in proactive productivity-enhancing initiatives. Then if we ask, what about the ANC champions of this agenda? I called them here the Internationalist Social Democratic, or we called them that, I think, Alan, the Internationalist Social Democratic wing of the ANC. It's embedded, it loses, it's hemmed in all directions. On the one hand, it loses because it's embedded in an alliance with the Communist Party and COSATU, both vociferously opposed to market-based approach to reforms. On the other hand, it consistently is hemmed in by National Treasury, which I dare say adopts a market fundamentalist libertarian views of these reforms and is also consistently pushing back against proactive initiatives. And so what you've basically got is that the champions of a proactive adaptive industrial policy are not as politically strong as it might have seemed in the beginning, hence the title of our paper, Elaborate Scaffolding but Weak Foundations. The further feature of this, just to note it, is this issue of rules versus cohesion. First, because of this pattern, there's a weakness in terms of the embrace of proactive initiatives. The system is inflexible, the champions are relatively weak. As a result, if one looks at the experience of how you actually get active industrial policy, it needs a more hybrid rules-deals frame. We see this in other comparative middle-income places with an orientation towards productivity, and that's missing. And third, now this is a paradox. Because the system is so profoundly anchored in formal rules, it becomes disproportionate, it becomes very vulnerable politically. It's easy for rules to become empty shells. And the term that's often used is to become isomorphic mimicry, that seeming compliance with rules is the outer form, and it's a substitute for active engagement with the developmental agenda. But critically also, not to over-interpret here, it's also the case if we look across the world, we don't have to look very far, if we just, that the triumphalist good governance narrative as a means to achieving these outcomes, which was often framed as generally emerged as overstated elsewhere. So I'll come back to what is to be done at the end of the presentation. I now want to shift to the second area which Sam flagged, which is the area of social provisioning, and just going to say a little bit about the book on the politics and governance of education. It's a large story, told it at UCT in November and at some other settings here, and who knows, maybe we'll tell it again, but let me just ask the education story. In particular, want to ask, so a classic South Africa story is government delivers, and delivery is the bureaucracy. And so how far can a preoccupation with bureaucracy as a means to delivery take us? What do we learn from this research? First, some good news. Tim, second point for you, Tim. You win again when you said to us that we some prospects for social provisioning success, if you actually look at the data in the South African case. Major shift in spending, both levels and proportions. The share of public expenditure going in education going to the top 20% of the distribution is cut in half between 1993 and 2000, which is that rapid reduction in inequality been described as unequaled in modern history when you look at a broad comparative context. Look at access. Compulsory scoring up to age 15 is achieved quickly. And secondary enrollment rises rapidly. It's not at 100%, it's up to 75%. Third, as we know, sustained institutional transformation, but South Africa, consistent with many, many other countries the world over, while it's addressed the access problem, it hasn't addressed the quality problem. So let's ask what's going on with quality. That's what our research does. The research program, applying the frameworks that Tim has described, is a multi-level program. There's research at the national level. There's a paper written There's a paper written by Vino Naidu and Robert Cameron on the national level. I'm going to speak to the provincial level research for the most part here, which are other papers written by Vino and colleagues at Rhodes and Robert Cameron, myself, on the Western Cape. And we also have in the book, and I'd urge you to read them because they're really rich and fascinating, the school level case studies and how they play out. But I'm going to focus this predominantly on what we learned around the provincial level education bureaucracy. So to begin, and actually this is a good opportunity to acknowledge one of our other colleagues, our newly appointed honorary or adjunct professor, Ian Goldman, who was in DPME, Department of Policy and Performance Monitoring and Evaluation in the presidency when this was done. These are results of the presidency's management performance assessment test using key performance indicators to contrast the quality of bureaucracies. And it's done across 120 or more. How many organizations was this done in? 150. 150 organizations, some of which were education departments at the provincial level. If you scored a 3, it meant you were fully compliant with what that indicator was measuring. If you scored a 4, you were better than fully compliant. And the Western Cape, and we know our Western Cape politicians, they love this, the Western Cape turns out to be terrific. Of those performance indicators, 79% the Western Cape is at least fully compliant, if not better. The Eastern Cape, which is the comparison, turns out to be disastrous. 59% of those indicators level 1 compliance. So if you start with that and you just look at bureaucratic quality, we have a very interesting experiment there. If I had time for the full presentation, you would see how there are all kinds of really interesting paradoxes and surprises, especially when you drill down into the school level. But a few of those paradoxes will emerge, and they begin to emerge here. If remember, we don't actually care. Access is one thing, quality is another. Management quality through key performance indicators is one thing, and learning outcomes is another. And it turns out that when you actually take measures of learning outcomes across Southern and Eastern Africa, and you can drill down to provincial level, what emerges, and there's another chapter in the book which explores this econometrically, holding constant a whole bunch of other variables, that while the Western Cape indeed on these variables turns out to be a significantly better performer than the Eastern Cape, Kenya, 1/5 the per capita income of the Western Cape. Kenya outperforms the Western Cape in its learning outcomes. So there are two things to explain, the one of which is seemingly intuitive, but I think we'll take it in an interesting direction. What's going on with the Western Cape versus the Eastern Cape, and how does one address that? The other one is what's going on with the Western Cape and Kenya, and how does one incorporate that into the narrative? So let me walk through those two. Let me begin first with the Western Cape and the Eastern Cape. And here, the story is a seemingly straightforward application of what you heard from Tim and the applications to Sam, which is but it has a critically important implication for the South African discourse. The implication is you can tell a story that says, well, the problem is bureaucracy, and at approximate level, when you contrast the Western Cape and the Eastern Cape, it's true. But the question is, what are the drivers and the determinants of bureaucratic behavior and performance? And the usual narrative says, well, it's capacity, invest in capacity. But actually, our narrative says that there are fundamental contextual drivers. And what chapter 7 of the book contrasts these, but I'll just summarize here. It says, let's take the 3 core variables that we flagged around the political settlement, the social foundations, the political configuration, and the institutional inheritance. And you see how the Western Cape has a very supportive environment for the quality of bureaucracy, but the Eastern Cape has a particularly, it's almost a perfect storm of dysfunction in terms of the potential for bureaucratic quality. What's that about? First, social foundation. The Western Cape is actually broad. If you look at the data on this, the Western Cape has a strong, politically demanding middle class. The Eastern Cape has essentially no middle class. The Western Cape has an ethnically diverse electorate, and I'll come back to this over here too, highly competitive elections. The Eastern Cape, de facto, the voice of the disproportion, the de facto, there's limited voice. The population is disproportionately poor and disproportionately silent in relation to its political leadership. By political configuration, the Western Cape is interesting in the context of the framework. Highly competitive elections. I think 7 or 8 changes of the nature of a governing coalition in the last 25 years in the Western Cape. But between elections, political authority is pretty concentrated. The Eastern Cape, superficially electorally dominant, so superficially it's concentrated, but in practice, and then again the chapter Vino does an extraordinary job of drilling down, in practice the degree of intra-party fragmentation inside the Eastern Cape, those who know the Eastern Cape are familiar with, is extraordinarily wide. So in practice this is a very fragmented, dispersed political configuration. And to add to all of this, the Western Cape inherits from the apartheid era, because of the way the provinces are drawn, an impersonal bureaucracy. The Eastern Cape has to patch together 2 patronage bureaucracies from former Bantustans. So in sum, when we ask the question, how do we account for the weakness, what we have in the Eastern Cape is a perfect storm of structural weaknesses. And the policy recommendation, fix the bureaucracy, is a little bit like if I wanted to play, I'm going to draw on that part of my life that's spent in the US, if I wanted to play basketball and play the center, just become 7 feet and then you'll be really good at what you're trying to do. Because there's a set of structural characteristics, and frankly this experiment gets run. This experiment gets run in the Eastern Cape because national government steps in 2011 and says, this is so dysfunctional, we're going to take the Eastern Cape Department of Education under, it's section 100, is it, I think again, under, we're going to take this under administrative takeover. It's done. 3 to 4 years later, it's scaled back without actually making a dent in bureaucratic functioning. So that's the Western Cape, Eastern Cape narrative. It underscores the limits from that angle. But there's another angle, the degree to which Kenya emerges as a positive outlier. So what this does is it says, what is the expected score in these learning outcomes versus the actual score? If you're on the 45-degree line, it means that your actual score is the same as the expected score. Kenya is an extraordinary outlier in relation to that. And the question is why? And when we probed this, and this is discussed in chapter 10 in the book, reached out to a variety of people working in Kenya and then got a rather fascinating answer from an education policy expert who's been living in Nairobi, works broadly and comparatively, but he's been there for 10 years. And this is what he said. He said, basically, what happens in Kenya is Kenya has a standardized exam. It's like the matric exam here, but it's at the end of, I think it's 7th or 8th grade. And it's a standardized exam at the end of 8th grade. And when the results come out and they're posted at the school level, if the school does well, the community gives the principal a parade. And if the school does badly, the community forces that principal out. And what we do in the book is we probe where this came from, and the roots of this, they're deeply rooted actually in Kenya's political history dating back to the 1920s. It's anti-colonial struggles, it's struggle for independence. Jomo Kenyatta was a school teacher, the head of the Kenyan Teachers Training College. He embraces, when he becomes president of Kenya, education as a priority, puts Harambee front and center in relation to this. So if we ask what accounts for the disconnect between the Western Cape and Kenya. The startling difference lies here, and leaping one way in which we think about this and also anchor this conceptually, and the book talks much more about this, is the risk of what Pritchett and others in our work we call the black hole of process compliance. We should know we're in the Western Cape. We are all trapped in the black hole of process compliance. What is that? It's a world where your bureaucracy is coherent in terms of its functioning and its compliance with processes, PFMA if you like in this case. However, compliance with process becomes an end in itself, and the alignment to learning is low. And so you can find yourself in a trap. And often the nature that this trap plays out is the solution to the black hole of process compliance is not more process compliance. It's finding ways to loosen the grip of that process compliance. Again, a longer story for education, but let me just summarize what is to be done in 2 slides. And now I'm trying to pull together what we've learned from all of the ESID studies and from the South African studies. So the first one is, what is to be done at the micro or meso level? I think the critical message, and this is relative to the way the discourse tends to play out in this context, is focus less on systems, not only on systems, but on specific problems, specific actors and their role in relation to these problems, including the empowerment of actors to innovate, and specific pockets of effectiveness, not just systems. That's true in general. It manifests itself in the business state space. We're seeing, in the context of the earlier discussion, renewed efforts at more flexible business-government cooperation. But also it implies the importance of championing local sectoral economic development initiatives with multi-stakeholder coalitions. And actually Mike and I wrote a paper on the interplay between the multi-stakeholders at the local level and the national level dynamics. It must have been 6 years ago, Mike. So that was one. Second, similarly, the same theme comes up in education. And again, the preoccupation with, instead of the preoccupation with bureaucratic fixes, a shift around the direction of what I call in the book all for learning. Encourage learning-oriented innovators at all levels of the system. Encourage learning-oriented innovators within the bureaucracy. Encourage learning-oriented partnerships with NGOs rather than, as was the history in the Western Cape for much of the last 6 years, shutting out NGOs. Encourage rather than seek to revoke the rather progressive rules of the game for participatory school governance that exist already. So that's this micro-meso level. But again, just to end, what is to be done? What is the big picture story? And the big picture story, coming back again to my conversation with Tim, is this. That one implication of this work is that the combination of impersonal institutions, very high levels of inequality, slow growth, and weak inter-elite cohesion, which is one way to describe this, and that's not just economic versus political, it's much broader, as we know. Weak inter-elite cohesion, that is not likely to be a sustainable combination that's operating. There are 2 pathways that can follow from that, dependent on the broader development strategy which is adopted. There's the status quo, and the status quo, even though we perhaps have a brief hiatus and pause now, if this structural logic is true, then the likelihood is that capture, patronage, and populist pressures re-emerge, and the pressures on institutions continue. Or the alternative is a pathway involving intensified efforts to foster inclusive growth and development, and thereby by reinvigorating the legitimacy of the impersonal institutional order. And notice some features of this. The one is that a narrow preoccupation with growth via improving the business environment, which seems to be the dominant narrative that we're hearing in this election campaign from both the governing party and the DA on the right of that narrative does not actually get to the root cause of the institutional reversal which is described there, and that a positive path depends more on renewed inter-elite consensus on a next generation development pathway which offers renewed promise for inclusive development. And this aspect of the story, frankly, in between the good governance narrative and the fix the business environment narrative and all the other narratives that we hear in South Africa, this discourse is to a disturbing extent underdeveloped. And that's our story. Thank you.
Musa,
Thanks.
you have the floor. Musa Nxele.
Okay, so this research informs the course that we offer here at the Mandela School, as well as actually the master's program. In the particular course that I teach, we try to bring together this material from understanding the complex context of policymaking to the complex problem of policy implementation. And so this is very informative research for us in giving us tools as researchers and analysts in this field of development policy and practice. It definitely helps us shift our thinking from the good governance agenda to which we might not actually have in different contexts, and to a much more hopeful point of departure where we think about where we are and what we actually have, and what are the creative entry points to reform in that space. It's very helpful in that it also brings together literature that has been rather dispersed, literature on rents on institutions, social orders, and state effectiveness. So I think that there is a very, it's an organizing kind of literature that brings this work together. So it's helpful in those ways, and I'll just also continue by highlighting some other helpful points, and then I'll move on to some questions that it actually brings up. So, of course, the big bang about this research is that it brings politics back to focus. It's a way of going back to fundamentals, essentially. And, you know, my professor, Professor Mike Morris, would normally say that at the heart of political economy is power, and the concept of power is an organizing framework of understanding how the world works. And so this idea of power and distribution is very important, and I think this work is taking us back to those basics of thinking about how development occurs. It helps also organize the difference in a global scale, why countries are different, what explains the differences in these countries. That's very important for analysts and researchers as well, to understand the entry points of reforms that work differently in different contexts. So that's very important. It highlights the kinds of different incentives, the kinds of different constraints and opportunities and risks in those contexts. Thirdly, the theory helps explain the pervasiveness of rent-seeking in developing countries. I mean, what we've seen in these presentations with the different case studies is that we can basically be able to see how the different kinds of policy problems, the different kinds of implementation problems unfold in a way where it's about power and the distribution of those benefits. And so it helps us to essentially reconcile with the literature of Mushtaq Khan, for instance, on rents and rent-seeking. While this research highlights the importance of context and how context matters and how politics matter, it also might as well highlight the importance of history, the fact that history matters. A lot of the variables or the case studies here actually were indirectly underlying or highlighting the importance of history, and that history basically organizes the politics that are inherited, the institutions that are inherited. And so it is very important to amplify this idea of history, and also that helps to reconcile the different fields that might have been dispersed in history, sociology, economics, and politics. So the areas that I think that this research can refine as we go forward is that the typology, of course, is yet to be tested. Issues of measurement and coding still need to be dealt with, and as I understand, that is where the frontier of this research work is. I think it's important, particularly for a country like South Africa, that this work amplifies the relationship between political settlements and inequality, and how we might better understand that, given that the typology speaks a lot about inclusion and about elite settlements and the consequences of that. So I think more research on that would be very important. The research work, the typology, the theory also needs to clearly allow room for ideas and ideology. It is not immediately obvious the role of these. It's very important. It seems to assume that elites are fundamentally rational. And so what about the role of beliefs? What about the role of ideas? So that's very important. The typology also may somewhat appear structuralist in the sense that it does not immediately provide room for the role of agency, the role of dynamism. These are important considerations for policy makers. You know, Brian always says to me, Musa, you need to read biographies. So agency is very important in understanding development in different development contexts. What are some of the questions that this work raises? What's the role of economic shocks? So economic shocks on power configuration is very important. There's a whole literature in economics about that, and it could speak to that literature. Political settlements, choices, or are they natural developments? Once again, it goes back to the idea of history, to the idea of colonialism, for instance, in different parts of the world. And at that point where decolonization was happening, where was there a limited set of choices around what kinds of settlements are available at those times. So it's also very important what were the constraints and the incentives and the stakes involved in consolidating different settlements that we see emerging. And how does this literature link to that, speak to the literature of post-colonialism as well? Another important point, actually, this was raised when Tim had did this presentation at the sociology seminar. I think it was on Tuesday or so forth. A very important question which I agree with and which I didn't feel that it was well addressed is how does this also speak to the literature on social contracts as well? I think that's very important. Personally, I think that there is a danger of underselling institutions. This was presented as work that now goes beyond the idea that institutions matter to the point that politics matters. But when we think about countries, for instance, that move from narrow concentrated to broad and then they fall back why do they fall back? And that might actually still point to this idea of institutions mattering. And so I think that we need to reconcile that rather than undersell institutions. Finally, it's not clear enough to me that how the typology explains difference in reform outcomes. So when we're thinking about Brian's last example of Kenya's secret sauce, for instance, so there are variables that seem to get highlighted here, such as community cohesion, such as agency once again, and these may be variables that fall outside the typology. And so while this typology and this theory that's developing is important, it is obviously not trying to explain everything. So what is it not trying to explain, and what is it trying to explain, and to whom is it useful? While it is clear how this literature empowers international donors and analysts, it is not immediately clear how we as locals can make sense of this literature in terms of how we deal and tackle our realities, our own policy problems, and our own policy work. So it's very important to understand that. I think linked to that is that the way of writing this work, the element of practice is very important. Already an outcome of this work has been Brian's working with the Grain book, and the manner in which that book lays out a very simple way on how this work has implications for practice is important. I think that needs to be encouraged. All right, I spoke very fast, but I hope that was clear. I will give over to Alecia, who will then elaborate with her comments. Thanks.
I think Musa just stole everything, covered everything. But I think maybe I'll just move away from the typology and just try to think about how this fits in, to broader discourses about governance and development. So I agree that neither the broad policy prescriptions of the good governance agenda, derived from cross-national data analysis, and also this idea of context matters, everywhere is different, can provide a useful guide to action. So what you're doing is really important. And I think the presentation was very clear, so I'm not going to repeat, the arguments that you've made. However, it is sad to think that, for example, the recently launched African Governance Report, the 2019 one, which still follows the good governance discourse to the T, where public engagement and national ownership is key, but makes no mention of such power relations at the domestic level, which speaks to how difficult it is to admit to the real incentives behind decision-making processes. So even though we are talking about this, we might not ever see it, in the reports that are being published by our governments, that what really happens behind closed doors. Now, the focus on powerful groups begs the question again, how do citizens influence those in power or become part of the in-group? How do they influence these coalitions? Do they have the power to change, especially if they are not part of the powerful groups? So social power, in terms of social configurations of power, which social groups do elites need to worry about, I guess is the most important question in terms of their capacity to disrupt political order and regime continuity. But this idea of political settlements makes one question foundations of democracy. For instance, what does this mean for the idea of public participation? Do elites only respond to bigger social forces that are present? If the masses were not to organize, would the apartheid regime in South Africa have had the incentive to talk and negotiate? And if the masses, would Mandela or leading the ANC alliance have believed that the deal would be worth it eventually? Scholars such as Levy would argue that inter-elite bargaining takes place in relation to contentious politics involving popular groups expressing their agency and forging various types of alliances with elite groups. But in some parts of Africa, we know that this happens, and when people do not feel like they can form part of groups, they can express themselves in different ways. And we want to see this. Recently, last year, I think in Uganda, with the arrest of Bobby Wine, he decided to express himself differently, through music, and that got the attention of President Museveni in Uganda. So the other question that I have, I'm impressed by the typology, but the question that I have is how do we get to the ideal type of political settlements? So you are alluding then to a puzzle about the right combination of political institutions and politics that have the best chance of improving development. But since there is no perfect case, and since political settlements are a result of historical processes and other factors, the question is what are the determinants of change in political settlements from one period to another? If changing institutions is not the answer, what is? So again, I want to know, because this is only my interest, and I want to see just how it fits with you, because this literature was not alluded to. What is the relationship between, as institutions, Musa did say that we cannot ignore the influence of institutions. What is the relationship between political party systems as institutions and political settlements? The hypothesis that you were making, I could also make for party system. I could say that on political and social inclusiveness, competitive party democracies are expected to outperform dominant party democracies because elections are a weak accountability mechanism. When removing a government through an election is improbable. On time horizons, dominant party democracies should have longer time horizons. In this case, dominant party democracies can behave, for example, like secure autocracies. So party systems also have institutional and policy-making implications, right? Some authors, in fact, they have supported this idea of competition and how it's desirable to the point that they have suggested electoral crafting to bring about a competitive environment, instituting an electoral law that, for example, restricts the number of parliamentary seats for winning parties to a maximum to limit the dominance of those parties and artificially bolstering the position of the opposition party is argued as one way to achieve this goal. Again, now rethinking the politics of development, personally, I think should also respond to ideas about rethinking development itself. And I was, fascinated by the independent variable itself, which is political settlements, but not much discussion on the outcome itself of development. So, not to say I agree with post-development theorists, but I think that their weaknesses should not be allowed to cause its insightful and radical critique of development to go unheard. The question of alternatives is an important one, and time and thought ought to be devoted to determining what post-development theorists mean when they call for the abandonment of the whole epistemological and political field of post-war development, as well as discussions of what alternatives to development may involve. Luckily, African governments, of course, through organizations such as the African Union, have no alternative. So my question is the contribution to social foundations and political configurations. What is the contribution that social foundations and political configurations play in crafting national development plans? I wonder if in your cases you've looked into what really constitutes these plans, and then get into the debate about, who influences what really gets in there, or what development should look like in all these nations. We also then get, in terms of education, as one of the indicators that you proposed, we get into issues, where we talk about education, language, what is believed to be knowledge, what should be the learning outcome. The measures we use definitely affect the outcomes that we get. So I couldn't help but think about, the participatory culture in Kenya and the political history, but also I wonder, what do they learn? When do they learn it? And these questions I thought are also very interesting. Lastly, the complex relationship between politics, which is messy, development, nebulous term, I think we should still talk about the fact that yes, there's some kind of, is there an inherent conflict of interest here? I still think you should talk about that a little bit as well in your work.
Okay, do we have a few minutes for questions? Mike,
Well, I don't have a question, I have a difference of opinion. So
please, I encourage that.
Okay, so I kind of agree a lot with Musa actually, but then I would, because he's my student. Ex-student. But no, I think the problem with this kind of overarching large presentation of such is that one is left with the feeling, well, I agree with that, but I don't agree with that. So how do you make a critique without sounding it seem like you're actually opposed to the, you know, to some of the fundamentals of the project? So one has to sort of feel, look, I better just start off with a health warning and say, yes, I do think that politics is important. You know, I think that actually is really important in terms of development. But I think that you're so, it seems to me one of the objectives of this project is to go for the good governance model. That's what comes through. And in doing so, you bend the stick too far. And that's the thing. I mean, Lennon said that when you engage in debate, you bend the stick too far and you have to come back again. So what's missing, I think, theoretically, is I don't hear anything about globalization, which is very puzzling. These countries seem to exist in isolation to each other, you know, to each other, as if internalized forces, global forces, don't operate, as if global value chains don't lock elites into particular forms of production. So that's a small thing on the, you know, as if political economy is not important. Politics is important, but I don't hear the economic side of the, you know, of the issue at all. So that's a small comment really about what I can understand about the framework. I wanted to rather focus upon Brian. I'm sorry, Brian, but I don't agree with you. Because what's missing in, I mean, I listened to the story and I think that's really weird. Actually, what's missing in your entire analysis, discussion, is what's obsessed us for the last 10 years and has formed the kind of state and state settlement, which is corruption, state capture, external elites, particular bureaucracies forming to engage in predatory capitalism. I use that word specifically because I got it from a discussion with you 8 years ago and I wrote an article about, you know, about it. So what's missing is that, and what I find strange is that your dichotomy here is too many forms of compliance and ladders of rules, when actually what happens is it's the only thing that stops in the end this particular set of political forces from finishing off the project which they have, both in terms of the state and in terms of the Eastern Cape. The most interesting book is How to Steal a City. What stops that is precisely an attempt at compliance in rules blocking the process. So that's my first big point. My second point is about education. It's not, you can't compare the Western Cape with Kenya. The one is a state form and the other one is a provincial form, which is locked within a state and which is locked within not only rules and levels of governments, but actually in terms of other social forces, i.e. The teachers' union. You can do things in Kenya. You could not possibly chase a teacher out of the school in South Africa, in the Western Cape, or anywhere else, because you'd come up against the power of SATU. The reason why that's important is that's a process of ignoring the rules, and in other parts of the country, they determine who is the principal through processes of corruption. So we come back to this entire story. It's a form of accumulation. It's a predatory form of accumulation with predatory forms of capital. I'm sorry, I'm a Marxist, I can't do without. Predatory forms of capital and predatory forms of bureaucratic organization in order to create these new kinds of alliances. So I don't understand how I agree with the parts of the underlying logic, but I don't see it when I look at the new forms of political settlement which take these, you know, into account. So institutions do matter, they're absolutely right. Are you a student also? Okay, PhD student. No. Okay, that's what I meant. I don't mean, you know. They're absolutely right. You better stick too far, you know. And institutions matter, and the forms in which political settlements capture institutions in order to have accumulation projects, you know, of their own seem to be critical. And that was my uneasiness in when I heard you speak both about the South African history and the Eastern Cape. You know, that's why I say go, that book is extraordinary, Chippy Oliver's book. You know.
Great.
I'm sorry, I took.
No, that's fine. That's fine. Thanks, Mike. I mean, in defence of Brian, I'll have to.
He doesn't need
One because I want to say a lot of other things. I mean, I heard you saying from the beginning, you know, that's why I was saying you're a moving target, because each time I thought I had you, and I read a little bit more, you moved. Because you come up at the end by saying you're actually not positing a theory, you're positing a different way of thinking about development. And so that was powerful for me, because, you know, too much perhaps of, you know, academia was about coming up with a sort of a theory that explains everything. And that's how you got the cookie cutters and the templates in the World Bank and elsewhere. I just mentioned a lot of Okay, so
just
please, and then you can come again.
some comments about Western Cape schooling, and we can maybe then take it a bit macro.
Right.
There's a disconnect between schools in poor areas and communities, or communities from poor areas and schools.
Right.
So, for example, you've got, first of all, people from those communities that have migrated in, they don't have roots in that community. They've come from the Eastern Cape or other areas. The second thing is you've got children who are commuting to school. So they're kids in, say, who are going to school in Woodstock, but they may live in Younger. They're travelling distances. The third thing is that you've got crime in neighbourhoods that is off the charts. And so it's very difficult for the community to engage with the school because of the high crime rate. And so those are disconnects. So it means that the community, because of the what's happening in terms of crime, in terms of commute, and in terms of parents commuting huge distances to work, and under great difficulty sometimes with trains, and therefore not actually having a stake in the local community because they're so exhausted just from going to work.
Yes.
If they can find work. And then on the macro scale, I think there's also a disconnect between what is happening in terms of state capture, in terms of whatever, and people's daily lives, and they can't see the connection between the two. So that's also a factor that is meaning that there can be less engagement with people not seeing how this affects them in their lives.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much. Ian, so Ian Goldman, of course, is appointed as adjunct professor of the school. We're very proud to have you.
I mean, two things. One is, one of the other programs we evaluated was Grade R, the reception year of schooling, yeah? And we did an impact evaluation of Grade R, which was a very powerful one. It covered data from 18,000 schools. And what came out very clearly was that higher quintile schools, there's 5 quintiles in the schools, the higher quintile schools in the better performing provinces were getting significant impacts from Grade R, and the poorer schools in the poorly performing provinces weren't. But overall, we were doing worse than Argentina and other countries. So it's a bit like your Kenya thing, the comparison. So again, importance of institutions, I think, in that and how they perform. But the second thing which just struck me was your point about the impersonal bureaucratic processes. And just my personal experience in my recent past in DPME, which was of an increasing use of impersonalized procurement processes, which totally destroyed the procurement process. So we were procuring evaluations in 2 months, it then became 6 or 7 months, and it was totally destroying the system that it was meant to support. That's the one, but on the other hand, a move towards a very personalised, problem-focused approach, which meant the system started to collapse, because everything had to resolve on the problem of the moment. So there's a funny combination of, on one hand, more impersonal system, and the other one, that all systems have got subservient to the problem of the moment, the political priority at that particular moment, and all the systems had to actually stop so that resources could go there.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Can I make one small request?
Please.
Can I request that in the other questions we not drill down into the micro level details of the educational study? And the reason for that is That's a big story. It's the presentation I've done before, and it's rooted very strongly in school-level case studies, which address many of the issues that are raised here, but which we didn't get into. And I don't know how to solve this in this setting, other than to say, at that level of micro, I put some ideas out there. There's the book, there's another conversation.
Yes.
Not now.
Right.
Is that right?
Okay. No, thanks. Please. Yeah, you can go ahead.
Thanks very much.
Yeah.
Very interesting, and obviously very important for us who've been many years in government to try and reflect on these sorts of things.
Yeah.
First comment I want to make is I think the CODESA process was pronounced at the end to be sufficient consensus. And I think here you have in itself a very interesting case study of what is under discussion today. Is that at some point in time, the powers that be, which was a pretty wide, many UDF and all the rest of them participating in that process, it was a pretty wide consensus. Note also that the key ANC negotiator is the current president.
Yes.
And just by reflection on sitting listening to all this is that understanding that sufficient consensus is probably the game that's being played at the moment to take us forward, hopefully into a post-Zuma period. But those interest groups are still all running around and playing their games, particularly those that have a vested interest.
Yes.
And I just wanted to mention, the Western Cape has for many years used this notion of the whole of society. And, it sort of pops in this presentation, or the presentations we've had today, in the sense that there should be more than just government making decisions, and it's beyond just the good governance thing. It's just a question as to how, or perhaps it's another case study to be looked at. How has that worked out? I don't think it's resulted in more inclusive development. I think it's probably resulted in a lot more confusion. Comment.
Thank you, Laureen. Platsky, that's useful. Democracy is a lot more difficult than dictatorship, isn't it?
Hello, so I just finished my master's at SOAS, and for my dissertation, I tested out the typology, looking at various settlements in Zimbabwe from 1979 at the negotiation of independence to the point where Mugabe was removed in 2017. So I just have a question, probably seeking clarification. So my question is, how do political settlements, or how does the framework interact with development when there are ruptures that facilitate the entrenchment of problematic institutions that concretize authoritarian governments, especially when the ruptures are violent? So I just, for any of the panelists who will take that.
Thanks. So perhaps when we get to the end, the panelists will come back and offer some comments. Lisa, go back.
No, thank you. I just want to say that it's also helpful when we talk about the political settlement agreements to maybe deal with them in the context. Because if you take the South African one, the ruling elite was able to determine A, its date of departure, B, the conditions after its departure, and the nature of the institutions that will exist after its departure. If you take Section 247 of the interim constitution that deals with school governance, which was part of the ruling elite to entrench and insulate ex-Model C schools from any direct intervention from the democratic state, and deny that government the public resources to give equal education to all. So, I think it's important to understand the transplacement in terms of the South African context. The second issue is the point that Mike Morris is making. If you take education, by late 1991, 1990, in the Congress of South African Trade Union, there was no discussion of the NQF. There was no discussion of OBE. There was no discussion of standards and its associated nomenclature. Right? There was a political shift from people's education for people's power to more acceptable ideology of the NQF, which, Mike, was a result of a global field of education that imposed itself on nation states to converge on these common structures and practices, of which Australia and New Zealand at that time played a significant role through NUMSA, the National Union of Metal Workers, with big business to impose on the education system this NQF, OBE, standards, the whole gimmick that has undermined the capacity. Remember before, sorry, just to make that clear, there was curriculum cleansing which happened through the NECC. We removed all the racist and the other stuff in order to take us through a transitional process to restore the culture of learning and teaching in the majority of schools which have already collapsed since 1976. Right? So I think we need to bring in the global stuff in understanding this thing and how it's undermining our capacity of the state to do what we're supposed to do.
Yeah. Thanks for that question, and the panelists will come back. Anyone else wants to come in? You want to ask?
I just want, I mean, perhaps one of the commentators is, I mean, you mentioned the sort of dependent on broader development strategy. Where do you see the current national development plan fitting into that?
Right.
I mean, is it not a consensus development strategy?
Right. The NDP. Okay, yeah, that's a good question. All right. Anyone else wants to? Yes. Jeremy.
Thank you. Thank you. So, what I really like about the ESID project is the determination to formulate sort of testable propositions, really, and to look and say what is the empirical evidence around political sentiments, which is a huge advance on the earlier work on political sentiments, which was very unempirical. Now, I want to bring back to Brian's first comment, though, which was about economic growth. So he says that Tim, in the small hours of the morning, came out with a great insight that South Africa is exactly what you expect, given its political sentiment, which is, you know, a relatively low growth rates because of dysfunctional economic coordination or absence of economic growth coalition, but substantial redistribution through government expenditure, through social grants and things, which is a pretty good description of post-apartheid South Africa, right? And then Brian, also you said that, you know, that the political sentiment in your look had changed massively between apartheid and the present, right? So I'm thinking about, well, how different is Tim's 4 o'clock in the morning description of post-apartheid South Africa under the contemporary political settlement from a description of apartheid South Africa under what you're telling us is a completely different political settlement. So apartheid South Africa had way consistently poor growth rates relative to other comparable economies. Like contemporary South Africa, the benefits of growth were massively geared towards a small minority of the population. Then it was whites, and now it's not just white South Africans. That hasn't changed. And the apartheid state did all of the things in terms of social policies that the post-apartheid state does. So if you look at this longitudinally, right, it sounds to me that Tim at 4 o'clock in the morning would tell us that in fact the political settlement hasn't actually changed very much between apartheid South Africa and the present.
Okay. Okay, I think you can come back, Brian, but yeah, so South Africa, the apartheid South Africa had a long run. 1948, the last 10 years, well, they were dead in the last 10 years, but they had moments of high growth.
Yes. But it's true, the last 20 years of apartheid were very low growth.
Right, yeah. Okay, anyone else wants to come in? Yes? We've run out of steam. Time. All right. So perhaps yes.
I think we need to be a bit kinder to our
yes, please.
visitors. So I'm going to.
You want to rebalance. Okay.
And in particular, what I like about the frame is the focus, the corrective focus. I think that it brings to, for instance, the extractive industry in terms of the dominance of good governance. Because it brings back the importance of politics. And I think in South Africa in particular, where the good governance framework has gone completely off the rails as far as extractive governance is concerned, is exactly at the point where it indicates government's inability, for instance, to engage with more diverse political groupings, and leads to completely perverse outcomes where communities are disconnected from that benefit. So I think this brings back that important corrective.
Yes.
So for me, that's a really helpful outcome of this work. And the second thing is just the ability of government to enforce compliance. And again, South Africa is a really good example where we have really good legislation on the face of it. But if you go and look at the actual outcomes on the ground, because of government's inability to send an inspector out to go and do their jobs and hold them accountable for it, then it shows that one should not just only focus on how frameworks are, or legislative frameworks are formulated, but actually what happens when those are implemented. So for me, that's a really good corrective of this work specifically.
Right. Okay, well, thank you very much. I mean, that was, I think, very useful, very interesting reactions, comments, and questions. I have one myself, about the research program, because I must say I only read this recently on a few plane trips, and
help you sleep.
And I did. No. I found it very interesting. So my question really is about the research program. What's driving the research program? Because when I read this book, I was slightly disturbed because I thought that the research program was about correcting the World Bank's trajectory of the research trajectory, and its focus on perhaps its undue focus on what you call on corruption, and the withdrawal. It was Wolfenson, I think you quoted here at the beginning, who was very concerned about the direction in which some of these countries were taking. There was too much of corruption. And there were attempts to withdraw from funding. So that's your starting point for the research program. And as the research program proceeds, it seems to me, then when I read the website and some of the questions you were asking, I think on the website, answer a different set of questions emerge. So perhaps there has been a historical shift in the research program, and the questions you're asking now are not really the questions you started off with this book, and you said this book was in 2014. So since then, it seems as if you've reformulated the research questions. And I think that's important from where you started off in this book, which was a reaction to what was going on in the bank. And but I mean, what you're beginning to get now is, I think, a much richer tapestry that helps us understand what is going on in development, and what is the relationship between politics and the sort of more the underlying economic challenges. So I want to just raise that for you about the research program. How has that changed over time?
So how do we want to proceed?
Right.
Ryan, what time's my taxi?
Well,
you're going to be fine. It's going to appear in a few minutes. You'll be fine.
All right. I think you go first.
You go first.
Yes.
Right, well, so many questions. All of the good ones. I'll pick a. Okay, I'll pick a few. I mean, Alecia, what role do party systems have implications that are similar to those of political settlements? I mean, for me, I think that sort of party systems are expressions of power relations in society, and to some extent, of course, there's if institutions are respected, it then becomes a kind of reciprocal relationship, and that a party system can help consolidate a system of power relations. So how you would kind of estimate the independent effect of a party system over that of a broader political settlement, which is a combination of power and institutions, I'm not sure. Maybe you could devise a research program, but I don't see those two sorts of research agendas or schools of thought as being sort of necessarily in conflict, unless you were to claim that it's the party system that matters and not underlying power relations, but I don't think you would do that. Mike said that there's nothing about globalization. I mean, ESID from its inception tried to address what we thought was a kind of nation-state bias in political settlements theory. We didn't talk about it very much in this presentation, it's true.
Just referring to the presentation.
Yeah, but if you look at how we conceptualize the social foundation, it's perfectly possible for, say, the forces of global capital to be present in the social foundation of a domestic state, insofar as if these actors may well have veto power, they may well have disruptive power, they may be able to significantly challenge the governing coalition. So I think that's where globalization can come in, and it will come in to different degrees in different kinds of economies and nation states. In some they will not be very influential, in others they'll be very, very influential indeed. But I don't think that all states are kind of equally subordinate to the forces of global capital or anything like that. And then finally, Jeremy, very provocatively, apartheid South Africa is actually just the same as contemporary South Africa, so why do I want to say it has different political settlements types? I mean, I don't know the data very well, but I mean, my impression was that in its heyday, apartheid South Africa was actually one of the fastest growing economies in the world.
Since the 1920s. Start from the 20s.
Okay, so I might have to go back and look at the data, but certainly in the later days of apartheid, where in fact power is becoming more dispersed, the social foundation is becoming broader, the state is under increasing challenge, it can't concentrate on economic growth to the same extent. Nevertheless, it's still able to oversee the development of a very successful armaments industry, for instance, which may be a more dispersed and broader state wouldn't have been able to do. The fact that it concentrated on social spending, I mean, do you mean concentrated at blacks or concentrated at poor whites, or both?
On its social base.
On its social base, yes. But I think that South Africa is a little bit strange in that sense. But we do say that a narrow concentrated settlement can effectively deliver social spending to a narrow base. So it's elitist in the sense that even though it's directed expenditure at a kind of a white working class, which is kind of the basis of a lot of the apartheid state appeals to in particular. But it's still narrow in terms of the broader South Africa, and that we do see a kind of a broadening of social spending post 1994. So I don't think it's exactly the same, and I do think that the typology captures that. So I can go as soon as my taxi.
Unfortunately, your suitcase is in the boot of my car.
Brian, you'll be excused to run out.
6:30 will be fine.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Please go ahead.
So just briefly on that one, I think the typology holds up with Jeremy's challenge because it broadens, and we do have, look at what happened with the social pension. Sort of overnight, it suddenly becomes redistributed to the majority. That reflects the new social foundations and the problems.
That's empirically not true. That's not a good example because the pension predated 1994.
Okay, so it's origins, but the way in which... No, that's exactly what I'm saying. So you have narrow forms of social provision under a narrow unipolar political settlement. The political settlement broadens in its social foundations, as does the redistributive mechanisms after 94. And at the same time, the shift from unipolar to multipolar makes it more difficult for institutions to be run in the same way as they were. So I think it holds up quite nicely. Anyway, Brian's definitely going to have the final word on that. The point I wanted to start with in relation to Alecia and Musa's points is both of you said we needed more about institutions, and our colleague from SOAS made the same point. I think that's right. We do need to clarify this. Matthias and I are working on a paper here. Our basic theory, and it's in the framework, is that you have institutions over long runs, institutional legacies, colonial legacies and so on, which do help define development outcomes. But the extent to which those institutions become, how they function, how they're mobilised, whether they become more or less impartial and more or less effective, depends on the configuration of power at given times. So they can be mobilised progressively by certain configurations of power, they can be decimated and captured and undermined by specific configurations of power. And we have great examples of this from all of our work. Zimbabwe's one, Rwanda and Ethiopia have now got to a stage after 3 or 4 decades of not performing well, where there's a configuration of power in favour of mobilising institutional legacies in particular directions. So I think we need to work on that a bit more, but I think that the framework can deal with it. Don't know enough about Zimbabwe to go into further depth. Zimbabwe is where I really part company with post-colonial thinking, when post-colonial scholars could only refer to it as Mugabe recorrecting historical legacy. That's where I thought, okay, this is where I stop taking post-colonial theory seriously. If you can't understand what's happening in Zimbabwe from that, because you're lost in a particular way of having to have the evil other as colonial experience, then we miss how to frame social justice. So I think we do our part company with post-colonial theory there. We're also, it's rooted in culturalist readings, comes from literary theory and so on. This is definitely a political economy approach, and we're never going to. But there is something around power relations that joins the. But if you really wanted to force a marriage, then something around power relations might be worth encountering. 2 last points. Social power, you mentioned, where we don't say enough about that. You're right in the presentation. Do read the book on gender equity, domestic violence legislation. We have really nice evidence there about how feminist activists mobilise social bases in ways that become aligned with and also push against the grain. So how ideas and activists are mobilised in relation to dominant ideas and incentives helps tell a story about how social power can work in progressive ways, I think. And the last point, Tim's already touched on it, the globalisation point. It's exactly right, we didn't do justice to it here. It's there in the sort of policy domain, I think. So in the natural resource governance, we talk a lot about the power of international oil companies vis-a-vis the bargaining power of states. We talk about donors becoming embedded within political settlements and how they provide resources which allow fairly undemocratic coalitions to remain in power. Jeremy and I have written about how social ideas globally spread and become embedded. So I think it's there in the comparative work, and we should have done a better job on it here, but it's very significant.
Thank you.
Okay.
Brian.
Thanks. I'm going to make 5 points going from specific to general.
Sorry, could you put the mic on for me, please?
Sure.
Thank you.
Okay. Step away. Easier said than done, but that'll do. Okay, I'm going to make 5 points going from specific to general. First, 2 documents were referenced, the Africa Governance Report and the National Development Plan. Without commenting specifically on those 2 documents...
Can we get access to Tim's bag?
Don't take sense.
Take the right back from
that's the boot of the car.
When you do that,
I'm going to.
Right turn, please. Thank you very much. Okay, so first, documents are great. Documents often reflect a vision of development that says plan, then implement. They're often parts of a normative discourse. What we're doing is we're pushing back, and I'll say more about this later, against a development narrative that says, let's start with the documents. So that's my first comment. Second, the discussion on school governance. I think what's interesting, if one looks at the history of where did the momentum for participatory school governance come from, it came from two places in the 1990s. Indeed, it came from white elites seeking to protect Model C schools. It also was part of the participatory impulse of the RDP. What is interesting is that post-1996, the Model C school impetus just goes on its own momentum, and any effort to realize the participatory impulse of the RDP is put aside in a narrative development that's hierarchical and top-down. My first sort of exhibit one for that is the report written by Crane Sudin in 2003, where he explicitly says this is there as promised, but we need to realize it. It's a report commissioned by the Department of Basic Education, and it's buried without ever seeing the light of day. Third comment, Jeremy, I'm going to interpret your comment around growth a little differently. A point that you've made in a number of times is how do we decide when political settlements change? And your narrative sort of works if you decide that 1948 was a critical moment of the transformation of South Africa's political settlement. If, however, you pick, I'm going to say 1910, I might mean 1905, we could decide. If you pick that as the moment of shift, South Africa's growth rate from the 1910s right up, I think, overall till 1973, puts it among the most rapid growers. We can go back and look at the data, but I am we'll decide on our end point and our beginning point. But I'm fairly confident of this, actually. So are you. So I don't think so. Okay. Fourth, the comment from Alecia and Faisal on what drives this research program. Now, it's true, Faisal, when you read this book, that this book is written from the vantage point of someone who has been immersed in and wrestled with and struggled with the good governance agenda as it manifested itself in the World Bank. But I don't actually, even this book, I don't read it as being a conversation about the World Bank. I read it as a different conversation. I think if you ask me what is the purpose of this book, and I do need to underscore that this book exists alongside ESID. It's one of the early streams. I think the ESID program and typology and framework that we've seen is really an interesting sharpening of these things. I think all of these exist from another angle, which is in thinking about ways forward, take as the starting point, and Musa, as beginning with things as they are, and ask yourself what, taking a 10-year horizon, are creative and constructive ways forward. That's the spirit of that book, and that's the spirit with which I continue to work. So in that sense, I like to think that this is talking whether to South Africans in South Africa or people in any other country. And then finally, coming to Mike's question. Mike, I agree with you on the bending too far in the opposite direction. When I finished speaking and I reflected on what I'd said, I realized that there was something that I had perhaps underemphasized. To have the impersonal institutions that South Africa has had, I'm going to, no, but it's not quite, let me say has, just to keep it simple, that is desirable, and it is a tripwire against impunity. The strength of those institutions is a tripwire, but it's not an invincible tripwire. But I think that the 3 points that I would want to make, and I will hold, even having corrected in that way, are first, the presence of impersonal institutions is not sufficient. The narrative, and this is how my perception over these last years, the South African narrative that is preoccupied with its good governance and with impersonality as sufficient is missing some crucial dimensions of what would drive success, which actually we may not have adequately taken into account. Second, so that's one qualifier. A second different qualifier, the sources of weakness, and I'm going to speak now of the bureaucracy, but in different things, not only the bureaucracy, are, and this is what the Eastern Cape example tells, they're deeply, deeply rooted. It's not just in the education department, it's not just the union story that we think it is when you drill down in depth and look at those. And indeed, the case studies that we did are really, really striking in terms of coming to grips with what those micro level, school level dynamics look like in there. So that's my second comment, that it's our story that we can fix it and it's the unions. It is a much more difficult and challenging story. And third and finally, linked to that, given that the opportunities for strengthening bureaucratic capability, and if I like state capability more broadly, are in some ways more constrained than they superficially might seem, coming from I know you wouldn't do this, but coming from a public administration managerial perspective, and that's the negative side. The positive side is that the tools for achieving gains are often different and offer different ways forward than if we bring that impersonal narrative than we usually think. So, yes, thank you for correcting that overstreet. Yes, impersonality desirable. Yes, it's a tripwire against impunity. But there are a set of places we need to go that take us beyond that. And if we just stay in that space, I don't think we're seeing our ways out of some of the dilemmas that we confront.
Thank you very much to all of you for your participation. And thank you, the team.